Clay Allison wasn't your typical outlaw. In fact, some called him a gentleman gunman, while others swore he was completely unhinged. Whether he was riding into town dressed to kill or settling a score with brutal flair, Allison carved out a reputation in New Mexico territory that left even hardened gunslingers wary. But was he truly a madman or just a product of the violent, lawless frontier? In this video, we dig into the wild and often bizarre life of Clay Allison, the Old West's original bad boy. From duels and revenge to whiskey-fueled mayhem, his story is unlike any other. If you love untamed tales from the American frontier, hit that subscribe button now. We've got more legends, mysteries, and madness from the Old West coming your way every week. Robert A. Clay Allison, more commonly known as Clay Allison, was a prominent yet unpredictable figure of the American Old West. He worked primarily as a cattle rancher and cattle broker, but his name is more often remembered for his wild temperament and violent reputation. Born in Tennessee in 1840, Allison served in the Confederate Army during the Civil War, reportedly as part of a cavalry unit. Like many veterans of that brutal conflict, he returned to civilian life with a restlessness that would define much of his later behavior on the frontier. Allison was known to involve himself in personal feuds and physical confrontations, some of which escalated into deadly encounters. Over the years, he was involved in several documented altercations that included both gunfights and knife fights, some of which were with lawmen. His reputation for swift violence was reinforced by multiple accounts linking him to vigilante justice, including jail break-ins and lynchings. While these events were often seen by locals as acts of frontier justice, they contributed to Allison's growing infamy. His behavior, especially when under the influence of alcohol, was highly erratic. In one of the most frequently cited incidents, Allison reportedly rode his horse through a town while wearing nothing but his gun belt. This episode, while often repeated in folklore, is consistent with other accounts describing his unpredictable and theatrical personality. Allison's recklessness wasn't only a danger to others, it also put him at risk. According to reports, he once accidentally shot himself in the foot, a mishap that added to the perception that he was as much a threat to himself as he was to those around him. Though Clay Allison was never formally convicted of any major crime, his life was a vivid example of how blurred the lines could be between outlaw, folk hero, and citizen in the unsettled West. His legend continues to stir debate. Was he a disturbed man shaped by war, or simply a symbol of the untamed frontier? Clay Allison's early life. Clay Allison was born on September 2nd, 1841, in Tennessee. He was the fourth child in a large family of 9 children, born to Jeremiah Scotland Allison and Maria Ruth Brown Allison. His father, a devout Presbyterian minister, supported the family not only through his religious service, but also by raising cattle and sheep. This combination of faith, hard work, and self-reliance shaped the early environment in which Clay was raised. The Allison family lived near Waynesboro, a rural community in southern Tennessee. From a young age, Clay worked alongside his siblings on the family farm, gaining experience in livestock handling and frontier living, skills that would later define much of his adult life. In 1861, as the national tensions gave way to full-scale conflict, Clay enlisted in the Confederate Army at the age of 20. Like many young men of his time and region, his decision to join was likely influenced by a mix of local loyalty, family expectations, and a desire to protect his home and way of life. His enlistment marked the beginning of a transformative period that would influence his character, relationships, and the course of his life in the post-war American West, American Civil War. On October 15, 1861, Clay Allison joined the Confederate States Army, enlisting in Captain W. H. Jackson's artillery unit. Like many young men from Tennessee, he answered the call to serve during the early months of the Civil War. However, his initial military career was cut short. Just 3 months after enlisting, Allison received a medical discharge. Records suggest that an earlier head injury, possibly from childhood, interfered with his ability to perform duties as a soldier. The nature of this injury would later become the subject of speculation, with some believing it may have influenced aspects of his behavior in later life. Despite this early setback, Allison was determined to continue serving. On September 22, 1862, he enlisted again, this time with the 9th Tennessee Cavalry Regiment. The unit would go on to serve under the command of General Nathan Bedford Forrest, a controversial but highly regarded cavalry leader within the Confederate ranks. Forrest earned the nickname Wizard of the Saddle for his unconventional and aggressive battlefield tactics. Allison remained with Forrest's forces through the remainder of the war. In the final days of the Confederacy, on May 4, 1865, he surrendered with the rest of the command at Gainesville, Alabama, as the Southern armies collapsed and the war drew to a close. Following the surrender, Allison was briefly held as a prisoner of war. However, like many Confederate soldiers during this period, he was paroled just days later, on May 10, 1865. The parole allowed him and others to return home and begin rebuilding their lives after 4 years of national conflict. This transition back to civilian life would prove challenging for many veterans, and for Allison, it marked the beginning of a tumultuous path that would later define his legend in the American West. Post-Civil War. After returning home from the Civil War, Clay Allison became involved in a series of personal disputes and incidents that began to shape his growing reputation. One widely told but possibly exaggerated story involves a Union soldier from the 3rd Illinois Cavalry who allegedly came to the Allison family farm with the intention of taking control of the property. According to legend, a confrontation took place that escalated after the soldier broke a vase belonging to Clay's mother, a sentimental anniversary gift from her husband. The tale ends with Allison reportedly retrieving a rifle and using it to defend the family's home. While the veracity of this account remains uncertain, it reflects the deep post-war tensions that existed between returning Confederates and occupying Union forces during Reconstruction. Whatever the true cause, Clay Allison and several members of his family, including his brothers Monroe and John, sister Mary, and her husband Lewis Coleman, chose to head west shortly thereafter. They eventually settled in New Mexico territory, where Clay would spend some of his most formative years as a frontier figure. In the towns of Cimarron and Elizabethtown, Allison became known as a bold and sometimes volatile personality during a period of local unrest known as the Colfax County War. This conflict was driven by disputes over land ownership and political control, and it drew in a wide cast of settlers, ranchers, and hired guns. In the fall of 1870, a disturbing case gripped the town of Elizabethtown. A man named Charles Kennedy was accused of erratic behavior and was suspected in the disappearances of several travelers, as well as his own young son. He was held in the local jail while townspeople debated what to do. Eventually, a group of residents, reportedly led by Clay Allison, took matters into their own hands. They forcibly removed Kennedy from the jail and carried out an extrajudicial execution. When Kennedy's home was later searched, evidence was found that confirmed the townspeople's worst suspicions. The remains of multiple individuals, including Kennedy's son, were discovered at the property. Some accounts claim that Allison went a step further by severing Kennedy's head, placing it in a sack, and riding nearly 30 miles to Cimarron. There, he allegedly displayed it publicly in front of the saint. James Inn. While the story has become part of Old West folklore, its gruesome details remain debated among historians, and it's unclear how much was fact versus frontier legend. Despite his reputation for impulsiveness, Allison maintained friendships with other notable figures. He once participated in a friendly quick-draw contest and was outpaced by a man named Mason Bowman. Rather than take offense, Allison befriended Bowman, who helped him refine his shooting speed and technique, highlighting a rare moment of humility and personal growth. Later, on October 31, 1878, Allison became involved in a skirmish in Wheeler County, Texas, during the final years of conflict between settlers and indigenous groups. While riding through the countryside, he encountered a homestead under attack by a group of Native Americans, possibly Comanches. After failing to secure military assistance from the nearby U.S. cavalry, Allison organized a group of local ranchers and cowboys to ride out and assist the besieged family. The confrontation was brief, with one member of the attacking party reportedly killed before the others withdrew. Events like this added to Allison's image as someone willing to act when others hesitated, sometimes praised as courageous, sometimes criticized as reckless. Notoriety as a gunfighter. On January 7th, 1874, Clay Allison became involved in a deadly encounter with a man named Charles Chunk Colbert, a figure already known in the region for his involvement in multiple fatal confrontations, reputedly as many as 7. Earlier that day, the two men had participated in a horse race before riding together to the Clifton House, a well-known inn in Colfax County, New Mexico. Despite a history of animosity between them, they agreed to share a meal. Years prior, Allison had reportedly gotten into a heated dispute with Colbert's uncle, Zachary Colbert, during which Allison physically confronted the man for allegedly trying to overcharge him at a ferry crossing on the Brazos River. This earlier incident likely contributed to underlying tension between the two. While dining together, Colbert unexpectedly attempted to draw his pistol during the meal. However, as the story goes, the barrel of the gun caught against the edge of the table, giving Allison just enough time to respond. He drew his own weapon and fired a single shot, fatally wounding Colbert. Later, when asked why he had agreed to dine with a man he believed might try to harm him, Allison reportedly replied with a dark sense of frontier justice, "Because I didn't want to send a man to hell on an empty stomach." The comment, whether factual or part of later embellishment, quickly became part of the legend surrounding Allison and added to his growing notoriety. By the mid-1870s, Allison's reputation as a bold and unpredictable figure had taken firm root in the folklore of New Mexico. On October 30th, 1875, during the height of the Colfax County War, a bitter and complex struggle over land grants and local power, he was said to have led a group of townsmen in the lynching of Cruz Vega. Vega was widely suspected of involvement in the recent killing of Reverend F.J. Tolby, a Methodist circuit rider whose death had deeply unsettled the Cimarron community. The group reportedly hanged Vega from a telegraph pole just outside Cimarron. Though the legal system at the time often struggled to maintain order in such remote regions, these acts of frontier justice sparked further cycles of retaliation. Just 2 days later, on November 1st, tensions rose again when members of Cruz Vega's family, led by his uncle Francisco Griego, approached Allison at the Lambert Inn, now the historic St. James Hotel in Cimarron. Accounts say the men confronted Allison and accused him of playing a central role in Vega's death. During the argument, Griego allegedly reached for his revolver. In response, Allison drew first and fired twice, resulting in Griego's death. A formal charge of murder was brought against Allison on November 10th. However, after an inquiry into the circumstances, authorities determined that Allison had acted in self-defense, and the case was dismissed. These events, while controversial, continued to shape Allison's image as both a feared and admired figure on the frontier, someone who, for better or worse, often took matters into his own hands in a region where law and justice were not always clearly defined. On March 24th, 1876, a deadly confrontation occurred involving members of the 9th U.S. Cavalry Regiment, an African-American unit also known as the Buffalo Soldiers. During a dispute in Texas, 3 troopers, Privates George Small, Anthony Harvey, and John Hanson, lost their lives. A 4th soldier, whose name was not recorded, was wounded. Reports at the time linked the incident to a group of Texas cowboys. Among them was a man named Davy Crockett, not the famous frontiersman, but a namesake. And months later, he was killed by local law enforcement officers under unrelated circumstances. One confused and exaggerated account later circulated, claiming that Clay Allison himself had been responsible for shooting a black sergeant and several soldiers during a bar altercation. However, contemporary investigations found no supporting evidence to confirm this version of events. While Allison was briefly taken into custody for questioning, he was released when authorities could not connect him directly to the violence. Later that same year, in December 1876, Allison and his brother John rode into the town of Las Animas, Colorado. After stopping at a local saloon, they were approached by Bent County Constable Charles Faber. The constable informed the brothers that a town ordinance prohibited carrying firearms within city limits and requested that they surrender their weapons. The Allisons declined to comply. Faber then left the saloon and deputized two local men before returning to enforce the ordinance. According to eyewitness accounts, as the three-man posse stepped inside the saloon, someone in the crowd shouted a warning. What followed was a sudden exchange of gunfire. John Allison was struck multiple times, wounded in the chest, arm, and leg. In the chaos, Clay Allison returned fire, and one of his shots fatally wounded Constable Faber. The two deputized men quickly fled the scene. Both Clay and John Allison were arrested and charged with manslaughter. However, after reviewing the circumstances, the charges were ultimately dropped. Investigators concluded that Constable Faber had initiated the conflict by firing first, and that Allison's actions were in response to the sudden threat. This episode further cemented Clay Allison's reputation as a man who often found himself at the center of high-stakes altercations, sometimes due to his own choices, and sometimes as a result of the volatile environments he moved through in the American West. Alleged confrontation with Wyatt Earp. In March 1877, Clay Allison made the decision to sell his ranch to his brother, John Allison. After leaving ranch life behind, he relocated to Sedalia, Missouri, and later moved again to Hays City, Kansas. It was there that he transitioned into a new profession as a cattle broker, taking advantage of the thriving cattle trade in the region. Eventually, Allison's work brought him to Dodge City, Kansas, a bustling frontier town known for its saloons, cowboys, and trail drives. At the time, Dodge City had earned a reputation as a rough cattle town, and Wyatt Earp was serving as a deputy marshal. When Allison arrived, his reputation as a bold and unpredictable figure from New Mexico and Colorado had already reached the local lawmen. According to later claims by Earp and his biographer, a dispute arose between the town authorities and several cowboys who were allegedly working under Allison. The story suggests that Earp, along with his friend Bat Masterson, confronted Allison and his men in a saloon, successfully persuading him to back down without violence. However, this account has been challenged by historians. There is no solid evidence that such a confrontation took place, and Bat Masterson was not even in Dodge City at the time. Additionally, Earp didn't mention the incident until years later, after Allison had passed away and could not dispute the version of events. Contemporary sources offer a different version. According to eyewitnesses, including noted cattleman Dick McNulty and Chalk Beeson, co-owner of the Long Branch Saloon, it was they, not the lawmen, who played a key role in diffusing the situation. They reportedly spoke with Allison and his men and convinced them to peacefully surrender their firearms, thus avoiding a confrontation. One of the most credible accounts comes from Charlie Siringo, who at the time was a working cowboy and would later become a respected Pinkerton detective. In his written memoirs, Siringo confirmed that McNulty and Beeson were responsible for resolving the standoff. He specifically stated that Wyatt Earp did not even approach Allison during the incident. 1880s. From 1880 to 1883, Clay Allison managed a ranch in the Texas Panhandle alongside his brothers, John and Jeremiah. Their property was located about 12 miles northeast of the frontier town of Mobeetie at the confluence of the Washita River and Gageby Creek. At that time, the land was part of Wheeler County, what is now Hemphill County, Texas. During this period, stories of Allison's eccentric behavior continued to circulate. One well-known tale, though likely exaggerated, claimed he once rode through the streets of Mobeetie under the influence of alcohol, wearing nothing but his gun belt. Such accounts contributed to his growing reputation for unpredictability on the frontier, though their accuracy is debated. Amid the rugged setting of Mobeetie, Allison settled into family life. On February 15, 1881, he married America Medora Dora McCulloch, a woman from Sedalia, Missouri. Their marriage marked a shift in Allison's life, as he appeared to move away from his more turbulent years and focus on ranching and family. By 1883, Clay had sold his Panhandle ranch and moved farther west to an area near Pope's Wells, a well-known stop on the historic Goodnight Loving Trail. There he purchased land near the Pecos River crossing at the Texas-New Mexico border, roughly 50 miles northwest of Pecos, Texas. This new ranch became the Allison family's home. Clay and Dora would go on to have two daughters. Their first child, Patty Dora Allison, was born on August 9th, 1885 in Cimarron, New Mexico. Their second daughter, Clay Allison, was born on February 10th, 1888 in Pecos, Texas, 7 months after Clay's untimely death. On July 1st, 1887, Clay Allison died in a tragic accident. While hauling a load of supplies in a wagon, one of the sacks of grain shifted and began to fall. In trying to recover it, Allison lost his balance and fell from the wagon. One of the wheels ran over him, causing fatal injuries. He was just 45 years old at the time. Allison was buried the following day in Pecos Cemetery. Nearly a century later, on August 28th, 1975, his remains were moved to Pecos Park in a special ceremony held near the Pecos Museum. A grave marker was placed at the site, although it incorrectly listed his birth year as 1840. Later, a second marker was added at the foot of the grave, bearing the now famous epitaph, "He never killed a man that did not need killing." This phrase, often attributed to Allison, reflects the way many remembered him, not just as a gunman, but as a complex figure shaped by the turbulent world of the American frontier. Clay Allison lived fast, rode hard, and left behind a legend that blurred the lines between justice and vengeance, fact and folklore. To some, he was a fearless frontier hero. To others, a man too quick to take the law into his own hands. But one thing's for sure, Clay Allison carved his name into the untamed pages of Wild West history with grit, gunpowder, and just enough madness to be unforgettable. If stories like this keep your spurs spinning, don't ride off just yet. Hit that subscribe button and saddle up with us for more wild tales, strange facts, and legendary figures from the American Old West. There's a whole frontier of stories still waiting to be told.